So now I have to okay, it's all good. So I was thinking about how Jesus said of Mary Magdalene, wherever this gospel's preached, tell what she's done. You remember that from the sermon if you were here. And I was thinking about how he was basically saying that, someday soon everyone in the world would know the story of Jesus. They would also know the story of Mary Magdalene. And what was he doing? What's that? Hold this closer to my mouth. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. Did you hear me so far? Yes. Okay, good. All right, so they would also know the story of Mary Magdalene. In other words, the gospel would be preached in the whole world. Everyone would hear the story of Jesus, but he wanted her story to be told along with his story, the gospel, and that's a lot of exposure for a human being's testimony. What was God thinking when he said that? And I think what it was, and maybe this is a little bit edgy here, but I think there's something that could shine through her story that he himself could not say. In other words, he could speak through her in a way that even his story could not testify. So that's what I believe is the power of testimony, and that's why I'm up here, even though I'm not really totally comfortable. And tonight is a really challenging topic because it's talking about marriage, and that includes, I had this couple that I was counseling in New Zealand, and I said, I always ask people, how are things going in your physical relationship? And it got real quiet on the phone. And then I hear the wife say, "You mean Sikhs?" Very bashful. It's embarrassing and hard to talk about. But I'm going to be including some stuff about Sikhs tonight. So in the book of Genesis, we read that God made man in his image. Male and female created he them in his image. And that word image is tselem in the Hebrew, and that means representation. So God made man in his image, male and female, to represent him to the onlooking universe. We were born in the middle of a war. There was this cosmic conflict already going on over Lucifer and the fall of Lucifer. And God created us to speak into that conflict and to show the onlooking universe what he was like. And that's why he made us in his image to represent him. I mean, that's a high calling. Now, let's take the color purple. It's a blend of red and blue. If I wanted to represent the color purple to you, and I showed you my red shirt, would that represent purple? No, it wouldn't. It would be, in fact, a misrepresentation of purple. If I took blue and I said this is purple, it would be a misrepresentation of purple. If I showed you a male and said it was the image of God, that would be a misrepresentation of the fullness of the image of God. If I showed you merely a female and said it was the image of God, it would be a misrepresentation of the image of God. It's the blending of male and female together that make the image of God. And there are two contexts in which that blending occurs. One is the church. Church isn't an old boys club, but it's also not a chick flick. It's a blend of male and female, and that doesn't mean that the men do this over there and the women do this. It's that men and women join together for the cause of God, and there's this wonderful blending that takes place. But the other context in which that blending occurs is, of course, marriage. So as Nathan has been pointing out, God said good, 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 and very good as he created the earth. But there was a point, and I know Nathan is probably going to mention this too, but I get first dibs on Bible verses, so I'm going to precede him here. There was a point where God said something was not good. It was not good for man to be alone. And so God created Eve out of the side of Adam, and that represented equality. That represented partnership, horizontality in that relationship. He didn't make Eve out of a bone in his head to represent her controlling or dominating him. He didn't take her out of his feet to represent that she would be trampled by him or subjugated to him. God's ideal plan was that man and woman would be in an equal partnership. I think that's pretty obvious from Scripture. I mean, we have a lot of arguments going about that, but I think it's fairly obvious that the subjugation of women came in as an accommodation of the fall, and that it's even then a qualified subjugation. And I don't want to get into that topic because it's just too hot of a topic, but there's this paradox that emerges from the Genesis account, and it's that we're equal but different. If we lose either aspect of that paradox, we failed at the fullness of truth. So if we lose the equality and say that one sex is better than the other, then we're denigrating part of God's creation. But if we lose the distinction between men and women, then we're kind of homogenizing God's creation, and that's not good too. There's distinction and difference and variety in God's creation, and so he wants there to be some differences, and he created some differences in men and women, and we need to appreciate both of those things. Go ahead to the next slide, if that's okay. We're going to talk about this Bible verse. I'm sure Nathan is going to bring this one up too, but like I said, I get first dibs. So what it says is, and maybe we should read it together. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. And then it's clarified that this is a mystery, but he's speaking concerning Christ and the church. So the relationship, the married relationship between the husband and the wife, is a symbol of Christ's love for the church. Marriage is so sacred in God's hands that it symbolizes his love for his woman, so to speak, his church. You know, I've worked a lot with married couples, and I've thought about this whole submission thing that is pretty hot topic in religious circles sometimes. And what I've come to is that I believe if husbands love their wives, that makes it not only likely that that woman will want to submit, but it will make it possible. In other words, if men don't love their wives in this Christ-like way, it makes it really impossible for that woman to submit in the truest sense of the word submission. She can comply, she can conform behaviorally, but God isn't going for mere behavioral conformity. He's going for the heart. And so the only way a woman can truly submit to her husband is if he is that servant leader that God has called men to. And here I'm showing how old-fashioned I am. I believe that men are called to be the servant leaders in their home, and that we have a servant leader crisis in our world today. And that if men would learn the love of Christ and how to express it in the home, and realize it's not just servitude, it's servant leadership. So that in and of itself is a paradox. And if men could grab hold of that and learn it, we would have happier families and happier homes. Now, I'm not saying women can't wreck their homes, because if I were to say that women were incapable of evil, I would be saying that they're less than human and that they're ultimately incapable of good. So I'm not saying that. I've seen women destroy their homes. I've seen men fail to be servant leaders and bring issues into the home. We're both capable of that. But let me just talk about servant leadership for a moment here. Had a couple in counseling, and everything that could go wrong in a marriage went wrong in this marriage. I mean, there was a domestic violence charge that got reported. There was several children involved, and there were issues with the children. There was a divorce that had been filed. The man had been unfaithful to his wife. Just every offense that could come upon a marriage had come upon this marriage, such that the wife was told by her doctor, "You must leave him or I will stop treating you because he is a health hazard to you." So I would get this couple together in a counseling session, and this guy was so checked out that he would fall asleep in the counseling session, paying me good money to fall asleep. But I would say to that man, you know, someday you're going to get this, and someday you're going to be converted, because you're not converted yet. I find that with some people you have to hit them right between the eyes, you know. So I say, I don't think you really know Jesus, or you wouldn't be doing some of these things you're doing, I'd say. But when you get it, And I told him to read the book, Steps to Christ. And I said, when you get it, you are going to become a servant leader in your home. Well, I ended up moving away from that area, and so I couldn't see this couple anymore. And I was kind of distraught about that. But I got a call a couple months later, and she said the miracle had happened. And that he was caring for her children, he was caring for her, he was bending over back. A total change in his demeanor, his spirit, his attitude toward her had taken place, and she was the happiest woman on earth. So miracles happen. You know, women are responders. And in order for there to be a response, there has to be something to respond to. And here the Lord, through his word, identifies what that is. That's husbands loving their wives as Christ loved the church. Now, I believe that this passage also applies to the act of marriage, to sexuality. And I want to talk about that just for a moment. You know, sex is a sacred thing. We're very shy about it, very bashful about it. But in God's hands, it's a beautiful thing. Look at this text. It says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. There is something in the act of marriage that the man gives up something of his body to the woman. Now, if you're not convinced by that, let's look at Revelation chapter 3 and verse 20. But let's look even farther back first. Let's look at Song of Solomon. It says, open to me, my sister, my love, my beloved, open to me. And then in Revelation chapter 3, it says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will sup with him and he with me. Do you know that the Song of Solomon was considered so erotic that Jewish boys were not allowed to read it until they were 30 years old? But here, the Song of Solomon is really using the imagery of the marriage act as a metaphor for God's love for his people. And then Jesus takes that thread and runs with it in Revelation chapter 3. I stand at the door and knock. If any man opens, I will come in. I mean, I don't mean to get too graphic, and I've gotten hate mail on Facebook about this where people get really aggravated with me, but I think it's true. And I've seen it both ways. You know, sex is if I could speak from the standpoint of behavioral science, sex is the neurological glue that enables a couple to bond together and to blend together in a way that would be impossible without sexuality. It literally changes the brain chemistry such that over the long haul of life, a married couple can blend their lives into one and yet somehow mysteriously remain individuals, because you need to maintain that tension between individuality and intimacy or you will lose both. If that woman or that man loses their individuality to the other, they can't possibly be intimate, because intimacy can only occur between two fully adult, mature people. And so there's this paradox of individuality and intimacy active in marriage, and sex provides the neurological response. All of the chemicals that occur in sexual connection change the brain such that people are capable of blending. I mean, think about it. No other relationship requires the level of blending that marriage requires. And so God is really, through sexuality, making the impossible possible. It's true. And I love that. But the only arena in which the Word of God and God himself condones sexual expression is marriage. And when we take sexuality outside of that context, we end up with negative consequences because we've shattered God's design. But even those negative consequences testify of God's original ideal. Now, I want you to realize, and you're going to realize at the end of this little story here that I have to share with you tonight, that God can work with our brokenness. And I want to reinforce that and restate it over and over and over. God is a creator, but he's also a recreator and a redeemer. And he can take the brokenness that occurs when we go outside of his design, and he can fashion things out of that brokenness that I think ultimately give him glory and give us great joy. I went to my pastor once and I said, I know God will help me with the disappointments that come upon me due to things that I haven't brought upon myself. But what about the consequences that I brought upon myself? Can God work with that? And my pastor was stumped. I could tell. He just kind of looked at me like, I don't know. But I can say with absolute confidence tonight that if you are sexually broken, if you have deviated from God's design, the enemy wrote part of your story. It's true. And your bad choices helped. But you and God together get to write the rest of the book. Amen? So, let's talk. Go ahead to the next slide. Oh, whoops, not that one yet. I want to tell you about my own backstory. I didn't know all this stuff. And I came into young adulthood craving connection. Didn't really have a good relationship with my father. Had an okay relationship with my mom, but, just craving connection. I was kind of a wallflower in high school, really. My best friend, Sue Cook, that I talked about last night, the girl whose house I burned down, she moved away. And she was like my social connection. And then I ended up going into this big high school, Nicolet High School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 2,500 students there, great big public high school. Oprah Winfrey went to that high school for a while. It's a huge place, not when I was there, but anyway, it's a huge high school. And I was kind of lost at sea in all these people. My best friend was gone, trying to find connection and having a very difficult time. And I was kind of a wallflower. But one weekend on a ski trip, I met, and I can't even say his name without a sigh. Rick. Yeah. I met Rick. Rick Kagan was one of the 2 or 3 cutest guys in my class in that high school, over 500 people. And he was just one of the Prince Charmings of the class. And I was basically an unknown, unpopular kid, just to be really frank with you. But we kind of bumped into each other on a ski trip. I think we ended up on a chairlift together or something, and we started to talk. And I've always been pretty good at talking, and so it was a pretty engaging conversation. And we ended up spending some time together and kind of getting to know each other. And then I found out that he had a girlfriend. So, I just kind of compartmentalized it. And of course, I was developing a crush on him. Who wouldn't? But got back to school and just thought, well, he's got a girlfriend. And he was Jewish, and the girls that he had dated, and he'd had a whole string of them, were all Jewish. And there's something about God's chosen people. They were overall, I would say, better looking, better athletes, better student. I'm serious. Like, they were just the high-ranking people in the school. And so he'd had all these beautiful Jewish girlfriends, and now he had another one, and I knew I would never be in that lineup. So I kind of gave up on the hope of anything happening with Rick. But, I really couldn't. We were friends, and so we kept interacting. Come to find out, he broke up with his girlfriend so that he could date me. And so I started down a completely different road than the one I'd been on. I'd been kind of in the shadows of this school, and I kept having these girls kept walking up to me and saying, "Are you dating Rick Kagan?" And I was like, yeah, believe it or not, I was as shocked as they were. So that went on for a long time. And I'm going to be really honest with you. I'm telling you, I'm out of my comfort zone here, but there were 2 issues in our relationship. He had a group of male friends, and they loved to get high together, and they would take some pretty strong street drugs. And I was bothered by that because I really believed that Rick and I were in love and that we would ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after and get married and have children. And he was taking some things that were known to cause birth defects in children, and so I talked him out of it. And I said, I would really be more comfortable if you didn't take all those drugs. And he loved me and cared, and so he stopped. But that put him at odds with his group of guy friends. And the other issue is he wanted to have sex, and I was holding out on him. So long story short, the guys finally prevailed on him and told him to dump me, and he did. And I was completely shattered. There is research out there that says that even a high school crush can predict long-term depression. And I'll tell you right now that too much, too soon, too fast romance so early in the game for me set me up for lifelong struggles with depression. But by the grace of God, really, I'm not in depression anymore. I have to say that. I have to testify and praise Jesus for that. Yeah, I'm better. I mean, I still go down pretty hard when I go down, but it's like 3 days and I'm back up. So praise Jesus. But I really struggled for a period of time. And that was part of the feed into that depression tendency. Well, I was completely shattered. I built my life around this guy. He was my whole world. I didn't even know how to relate to people. In that period of time, I started to wonder if there was a God of love somewhere. And I started to maybe pray once in a while. But after not too much time, Rick had tried getting with some other girls, but nothing really worked out. And he actually missed me. It was his friends that he broke up with me for, so it really wasn't about him. And we ended up getting back together for about a year. But I remember at the end of that year, I started to lose interest in him. And it mystified me because I had felt such intense love and passion for this guy. And I couldn't believe that those feelings were just kind of dissipating. And it's interesting to me that the Bible uses the word dissipation to refer to immorality or love outside of boundaries. Uses the word dissipation. The reality is we can't hold love unless we are living in harmony with God's law. God's law is not just a set of rules. It's a descriptor of how life and love work. God is saying, this is how you can hold the love that I pour down from heaven into your vessel. If your vessel is in harmony with the law of God, you can hold that love and relationships will last. But if your vessel is out of harmony with the law of God, it's like trying to carry water in a basket. It dissipates. And my love for Rick dissipated, and I couldn't love him anymore, and I had to break up with him. It just wasn't happening. He was shattered, you know? He dumped me, and then I dumped him. It's the short version of that story. But I came out of that experience determined to do it the right way next time. Shortly after that, came to Jesus, became a Christian, and joined a ministry that was very, very strict about any kind of interactions between males and females. There was this man on this campus of this ministry that I was part of that had this wonderful soaring tenor voice. And he would be walking in the morning, and I'd be having my devotions talking to Jesus, and I'd hear this beautiful voice wafting above the trees. And then I would see this guy, and he was just so handsome and so just interesting and strong in his personality, and he worked really hard, and I kind of developed a little crush on him, but I kind of felt like I'm probably not in his league. And also he had a girlfriend, and she was just a beautiful woman, and I just knew that this was never going to happen. But strangely enough, that relationship broke up. I left that place, but I came back for a visit. And when I came back for a visit, he was back for a visit. What had happened is he had moved out west for working with the U.S. Forest Service. He was a tree planter, and he had met another tree planter, and he told the tree planter that he wanted to pursue me. Now, this context, this ministry context that we were in, used something called courtship. It was not really dating in that it was much more structured. And so there was a lot of formality. He was never really allowed to talk to me. I remember he came into that little health food store that I ran, and I never really had a conversation with him. And he bought something, and I rung him up, and he said, "How are you doing?" And this was right at the time when I was kind of losing weight and becoming very thin and drawn. And he said, "How are you doing? I've been praying for you." And that, in the context that we were in, was really basically a bar line, I've been praying for you. So I was like swooning, Michael Schwirzer is praying for me, So anyway, so I was never able to really get to know him. But he ended up going out tree planting and meeting this tree planter, and the tree planter started bugging him and saying, "You need to go back and find that girl, and you need to tell her you're interested in her." So long story short, he drove all the way from Montana to Chicago, where I was working with a different ministry, to track me down and tell me that he was interested in a relationship with me. He went into the place where I worked in Chicago, and I was gone. I was visiting the place where we originally met in Michigan. And he was relieved. He was like, oh, I'm so relieved I don't have to follow through on this. But then he went to the place in Michigan to visit the old friends that we both had together, and there I was. So his friend that knew about it nudged him and said, Michael, you need to just talk to her. And he did. And long story short, we started a courtship. And we started to get to know each other. Now, would I do it differently had I an opportunity? I would. I think there are flaws in the courtship model. There's not enough opportunity to get to know each other. But it was an improvement on what I'd done before, to be honest with you. The fast and loose way of doing love just doesn't work. So we got to know each other over the next 6 months. Now, unfortunately, I had this problem with this eating disorder. And some ways into that 6 months, I developed the flu and I went down to 85 pounds. And somehow my mother got the wrong message, and she heard that I was 67 pounds, and my parents were all in an upheaval, and they thought I was dying, and really I could have been. But long story short, we did get married, and the first thing my husband did is he took me out to Montana to do tree planting. Go ahead and give the next slide. See, my husband had gone through a very similar experience. He had joined an ashram where they did meditation, and they also followed a very strict and even fanatical diet. And he had gotten so emaciated in that context that his pyloric sphincter had closed up and he could no longer eat. He ended up seeing the guru of the ashram levitate off the ground, decided he wanted nothing to do with that place, rented an apartment, and promptly collapsed on the floor of the apartment. Fortunately, there was a young lady that kind of liked him. She tracked him down, found him, and she took chicken broth and revived him, and he was able to regain strength, and he lived through. But he had been through something similar to what I was going through. So the first thing we did was we went out west, and we planted trees, and I had to wash clothes in the creek, cook over a fire. I was like Pauline Bunyan, you know, I was just like really, really living a rough life. And I had to carry trees up to my husband in a backpack, little seedling trees up in a backpack to him, high up in the mountains on a steep incline. And I regained my strength in a short period of time. And I really overcame anorexia because there was someone in my life that loved me enough to commit his life to me. And I may be alive today because of Michael Schwirzer. I have to give him credit. We've been married, let me see. Go ahead and go to the next slide. We'll show you the full gamut. Oh, this is us this is us on our wedding day, me on our wedding day. As you can see, I'm really stick thin. Not that I'm two-ton tussy right now, but I was even thinner back then. And here we are about ready to get in the car and go off. He had a Ford pickup truck. And go ahead and go to the last slide. This is Mr. Gorgeous and I on the shore. And I think in this picture, he's almost 70 years old. Yeah, I mean, he's amazing. So I tell him he's still hot, and he hates it when I say that, but I think he's really cute. Anyway, we've been married 40 years this June. You can applaud if you want. Thank you. And I want to say this, that, you know, marriage is super difficult, and I would say that humanly speaking, we are completely incompatible. I'm not kidding. Especially in the area of social involvement and socializing. He's very introverted. I'm pretty extroverted, and I'm very adventuresome socially. He not so much. You know, we have issues, and they're sometimes painfully obvious to people that know us and to ourselves. But even though we have issues, we really love each other. I mean, I can say of total sincerity, and there's unresolved stuff in our marriage. I still really love him, and he still really loves me, and it's forever for us. And I don't know how to make marriage as perfect as it could be. I think there's a real pitfall in comparing our marriage to other people's marriage, because every marriage is different. And my marriage is certainly different than others' marriages, but I praise God for what I have. God has taught me so much through my relationship with Michael John Schwirzer, and that is my story.